The moment my badge stopped working, I was still holding a pen. Not metaphorically. I mean, I had a Uniball Vision Elite uncapped in my right hand. The signature line on page 47 of the contract addendum was 6 inches from my fingertips, and the federal compliance officer from the Department of Defense had already initialed his copy. 14 people were in that room. 3 of them had flown in from Washington that morning, and my badge stopped working. I didn't understand what was happening at first. The door to the anteroom where the document authentication terminal was mounted just beeped red when I held my lanyard up. I tried again. Red. The compliance officer looked at me. I smiled like it was a technical glitch. I knocked on the glass panel beside the door, and the IT coordinator on the other side mouthed something I couldn't read. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a text from HR. 4 sentences. The last one said my system's access had been administratively terminated effective 9 o'clock that morning. It was 9:22. I want to be precise about the timeline because precision was always what I did. 26 years in federal defense contracting. 14 of those years at Halcyon Integrated Systems, a mid-tier defense contractor based out of Columbus, Ohio. We didn't make the weapons. We built the infrastructure that tracked them. Logistics software, compliance frameworks, the kind of work that nobody talks about at dinner parties but that keeps a $12 billion supply chain from collapsing on a Tuesday afternoon. I was their director of federal compliance, which meant I was the person who understood, in granular detail, every clause, every cross-reference, every documentation requirement embedded in a Department of Defense acquisition contract. Most people who hold that title are administrators. I was something closer to a translator, someone who could take a 400-page Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations supplement and tell you with specificity exactly which 3 paragraphs were going to matter 6 months from now when the auditors showed up. The contract we were signing that morning was called ARCAS 7, a $2.4 billion 8-year logistics modernization program for the Army's ground vehicle maintenance depots. We had spent 22 months in proposal development. I had spent 22 months building a compliance architecture so tight that our technical evaluators from the Pentagon told me privately that they had never seen a contractor submission with fewer risk flags. That was my work. Every line of it. My supervisor, I'll call him my division head, had been at Halcyon for 11 months. He came from a commercial software background. He was excellent at presentations, very good at managing up, and had almost no working knowledge of government contracting. I had known this from our 3rd conversation and had spent the better part of a year quietly doing his job alongside my own to make sure nothing fell through the floor. He knew that I knew. I think that was always the problem. 3 days before the ARCAS 7 signing, he called me into his office and told me that he would be leading the signing ceremony himself, that the company wanted to present a unified leadership profile, that my role going forward would be transitioning into an advisory capacity. He used the phrase, right-sizing the compliance function. I had heard that phrase before and I knew what it meant, and I sat across from him and nodded and said I understood. I did not understand. I genuinely could not process what he was telling me while he was telling me, because the part of my brain that handles workplace betrayal has always been slower than the part that handles contract language. I went home that night and I sat in my kitchen and I thought about the 22 months. I thought about the Saturday I spent on a call with the Pentagon's contracting office instead of going to my daughter's college graduation ceremony. I watched it on a live stream later, on my laptop, in a Marriott in Arlington, Virginia, eating room service pasta. She walked across the stage and shook the dean's hand, and I pressed my face close to the screen like that would close the distance somehow. I thought about my father's funeral. April of last year. He died on a Thursday. We buried him on a Saturday. I drove back to Columbus on Sunday morning because we had a source selection briefing on Monday that I could not hand off to anyone else. My sister hasn't fully forgiven me for leaving early. I'm not sure I've forgiven myself. I thought about all of that. And then I went to bed, and on the morning of the signing, I put on my gray suit and drove to the Hilton Columbus downtown where the ceremony was being held, because I had two things my division head did not have. One was the SCIS certified authentication token that released a final compliance attestation, a hardware device registered to me personally that had to be physically present to complete the Defense Contract Audit Agency's credentialing sequence. Without that attestation, the contract was legally unexecutable. It was a procedural requirement that I had built into the compliance architecture myself 18 months ago because I wanted a fail-safe in case of document dispute. I hadn't built it as leverage. I want to be clear about that. I built it because it was the right compliance structure. The second thing I had was 26 years of knowing exactly what would happen if that attestation wasn't completed. I arrived at the hotel at 8:15. I went through the registration process, collected my attendee credentials, and sat in the anteroom outside the main signing suite reviewing my notes. My division head arrived at 8:40. He walked past me without making eye contact, which told me everything I needed to know about how the morning was going to go. At 9 o'clock, the HR text arrived on someone else's phone too. I know this because the IT coordinator who was managing the authentication terminal got a notification that my access had been revoked, and he looked up at me from across the lobby with an expression that I can only describe as apologetic horror. I had already understood what was happening. I capped my pen. The signing began at 9:15. 14 people around a conference table, the Army's contracting officer, the DCAA representative, 3 attorneys, my division head, 2 of our company's senior vice presidents, and a collection of program managers and witnesses. I was not at the table. I was in the anteroom, watching through the glass panel, still holding my badge lanyard, the authentication token in my jacket pocket. At 9:19, the contracting officer asked for the compliance attestation sequence to be initiated. My division head nodded and reached for the terminal. The terminal required the registered token. He didn't have the registered token. He looked at the IT coordinator. The IT coordinator looked at the authentication system manual, which I had written. The manual said in plain English that the DCAA registered compliance token was a non-transferable physical device bound to the credentialed compliance officer of record, and that in the event of a personnel change, a 72-hour re-registration process was required before a new operator could be authorized. 72 hours. The signing was in 72 minutes. I watched my division head's face from the other side of the glass. I watched my division head's face from the other side of the glass. I watched him read the manual. I watched him look up at the room. I watched him look at the door to the anteroom. I watched him see me standing there. He came out. He said, and I want to get this right because I've replayed it many times. He said, we need you to come in and run the sequence. I said, I'm not an employee of this company as of 9 o'clock this morning. He said, I understand that, but this is a critical moment and we need. I said, I understand what you need. I want to make sure I understand what I need too. He stared at me. I said, I'm happy to complete the attestation sequence. I'd want to do it as an independent consultant on a signed engagement letter at my standard daily rate, which is $3,000. He said, you can't be serious. I said, the engagement letter takes about 10 minutes to draft. I have a template on my personal laptop. He went back inside. I watched him confer with the 2 SVPs. One of them was on a phone call within 90 seconds. I sat down in a chair in the anteroom and I waited. And I thought about my sister standing in the church parking lot watching me put a bag in my car. And I thought about my daughter on a screen in a hotel room. And I thought about 3,000 Saturdays I had given to this company. And I did not feel angry. I felt, for the first time in a long while, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. They came back with a number, $1,500. I said 3,000. They said 2,000. I said 3,000. I said 3,000. I told them I had done the math on the risk they were accepting by not signing today, and that $3,000 against a $2.4 billion contract was a rounding error they wouldn't find on a spreadsheet. They signed the engagement letter at 9:41. I walked into the room at 9:43. I completed the attestation sequence, countersigned the compliance certification block at the bottom right of the final page, shook hands with the Army contracting officer, and walked out. The whole thing took 11 minutes. I got a call that afternoon from one of the SVPs. He was not my division head's advocate. He told me that the board was conducting an internal review of my division head's personnel decisions and asked if I would be willing to speak with outside counsel. I said I would. 2 weeks later, I received a formal offer from the DCAA, the Defense Contract Audit Agency, for an 18-month consulting engagement, reviewing compliance structures on 3 other major defense programs. My division head had, apparently, created some documentation irregularities in the weeks before the ARCA 7 signing that the auditors found interesting. I took the consulting work. My daily rate was $4,000. I've thought a lot in the months since about what I was supposed to take from all of it. I don't think it was a lesson about karma exactly, or about patience, or about people getting what they deserve. I've been in this industry long enough to know that people very frequently don't get what they deserve. I think what I took from it was simpler than that. I spent 26 years making myself indispensable to competence rather than politics. I never played the game well. I was always too busy understanding the contract to understand the room. And for most of those 26 years, that cost me the promotions that went to people who were better at lunch, the credit that went to people who were better at presenting, the visibility that went to people who were better at being visible. But the thing about building the right compliance structure is that eventually, at some critical moment, the right structure is the only thing standing between a $2.4 billion contract and a room full of very uncomfortable people. I just had to be in the right room when that moment arrived. My name is in the bottom right of that signature block. No title under it, just my name, my credentials, and the date. That's all I ever needed. I've been asked, since all this came out, whether I planned it, whether the authentication token was a deliberate trap, whether I built that 72-hour re-registration requirement, knowing that someday someone would try to cut me out at exactly the wrong moment. The honest answer is no. I built it because it was the right structure. That's the only reason I ever did anything at that company, because it was right, because it was precise, because the work deserved to be done correctly regardless of who got credit for it. I wasn't thinking about leverage. I was thinking about audit risk. But I've come to believe that doing things correctly over a long enough period of time creates its own kind of protection, not in a mystical sense, in a practical one. When you build something right, the rightness doesn't disappear just because someone tries to erase your name from it. The structure holds. The compliance architecture holds. The 72-hour requirement holds. You can fire the person, but you cannot fire what they actually built. My division head understood politics. He understood optics and org charts and who sat next to whom at the executive table. What he didn't understand, what I don't think he was ever curious enough to understand, was the actual work. The granular, unglamorous, 400-page work that makes a $2.4 billion contract legally executable. He read the summaries. I wrote the footnotes. And on the morning it mattered, the footnotes were the only thing anyone in that room cared about. I think about my daughter a lot when I consider what this whole chapter taught me. She watched a graduation on a screen somewhere. Or rather, I watched her graduation on a screen, alone, in a hotel room. Because I chose the contract over the ceremony. I've carried that. I still carry it, but I've also tried to be honest with myself about what that sacrifice was actually for. It wasn't for the company, it wasn't for my division head, it was for the integrity of the work itself. Because I believed and still believe that when you take responsibility for something, you see it through completely, or you don't take it at all. That's not a comfortable philosophy. It costs things. It cost me Saturday mornings and anniversaries and being present at a graveside when I should have stayed longer. But it also meant that when the room needed someone who had actually done the work, there was only one person to call. There is something clarifying about that moment. Not triumphant, just clarifying. All those years of being passed over, of watching credit migrate upward toward people who were better at lunch than at contracts, and it turned out that the one thing no one could take was the thing I had actually built. I signed that contract as an independent consultant. My daily rate was $4,000. I shook hands with the Army contracting officer, walked out of the room, and drove home in time for dinner for the first time in longer than I can remember. My sister called that evening. We talked for an hour. It wasn't an apology from either of us. It was just a conversation, the kind we hadn't had in years, and that felt like more than enough. The work endures. What you actually know, what you actually build, what you actually stand behind, that endures. Everything else is just a title on a door that someone else will put their name on eventually. Mine is on the contract.